Welcome again to our online panel on the Rainbow Left. On this call, we're talking to veterans of left organizations that decided in the 80s and 1980s to make the Rainbow Coalition and the Jesse Jackson campaigns for president the space in which they saw the greatest possibility and potential for an independent, mass left political vehicle to emerge. Organizing Upgrade is hosting this panel with left veterans of the Rainbow for a number of reasons, but our primary goal is to draw out lessons from the Rainbow years for left movement activists today, especially as so many organizers and activists have turned their sort of strategic focus towards electoral politics once again. In many ways, I'm sure we're all feeling that these are exceptionally dark times. Not only is the right-wing ascendant, but a broader array of right-wing forces have access to the levers of state governance than in recent decades. The Muslim ban, the full criminalization and detention of immigrant babies and families, the hostility to Black-led movements are just some of the morbid symptoms of our time. Amongst the many places to find hope, however, we can turn to the shift in sentiment towards electoral politics from left organizers, with the insistence that we abstain from mobilizing in elections slowly eroding after the 2016 Trump election. There's countless examples of this that we could list, but I think the rise of major field operations for Black women and women of color candidates, as well as the huge growth of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, to now 42,000 members, I heard, are just two of the most exciting. Much of the invigorated left engagement in elections has taken place in Democratic Party primary electoral battles around the country, which is a very interesting development. But this raises really the stickiest of electoral debates on the left, which is, how should we view the Democratic Party? Is it firmly in the opposition as a bourgeois and corporate party, or is it a legitimate terrain of struggle for leftists to achieve their strategic goals? Does the left need an independent vehicle, or does that vehicle operate inside or outside the Democratic Party? The debates in and around the Rainbow Coalition, which we should all remember were based around a Democratic primary challenge from Jesse Jackson, mirror these same debates in many ways. It's these questions we hope to examine by talking to our Rainbow veterans today. So just a quick note about how this group came together. We wanted to assemble a panel that represented the diversity of left groups that involve themselves in the Rainbow Coalition. And there really was a pretty broad range of groups. And we think our panel today does exactly that. We've got a really great group here. There were thousands of organized leftists who made the Rainbow Coalition the focus of their work. We just couldn't possibly get everyone. And actually some of those other activists who are not on our panel are in the audience, and we really want to encourage those folks, along with everyone, to share your experience in the comments and to share your experience in the chat box. And just to make clear, we in no way envision this one panel as sort of the be-all and end-all to answer all questions related to the Rainbow Coalition. That would be foolish. We really just hope that this is the beginning of another round of conversations revisiting the Rainbow experience. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Fletcher to give us a brief historical overview.
Good. Okay, so good evening, and it's a pleasure to be here, except I only have 6 minutes to cover an immense amount of history. So let's rock and roll. I'm going to be focusing on the second Rainbow Coalition, which was the Rainbow Coalition associated with Jesse Jackson, or perhaps the third one. The first one being the one that the Panthers initiated in 1969. The second one was initiated by Mel King in Boston in his race for the mayor seat in 1983. But Jesse Jackson was the one who basically took it and moved it nationally. So I'll be focusing on that. In order to understand that entire period of basically 83 to 89, we have to first understand that there had been an electoral upsurge in the aftermath of the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it was a black upsurge in the late 60s, very early 70s, that started sweeping the South and a number of other places. Politically, you could say that it was liberal to progressive, although there were certain exceptions like Richard Hatcher, who was in effect a social democrat. But it was the overall character, I would suggest, to be that. That dies down in the early 70s, shortly after the de facto demise of the National Black Political Assembly. In the late 70s, however, there's a new upsurge that emerges and I use the term black-led because it wasn't just black folks, but a black-led upsurge starts in the late 70s, and it's a combination of everything from running for political office to ballot initiatives to fights around redistricting, and it starts spreading and gaining fire. The critical moment was probably when Harold Washington, the former congressman, runs at the request of a movement in Chicago for mayor of Chicago and wins. And this was sort of a catalytic event. There was shortly around the same time, Mel King, who had been a state representative, ran, and his second campaign for mayor, very unusual, very much the feeling of a mass movement, actually in both cases. So in 83, we started to hear this slogan, "Run, Jesse, run." Jesse Jackson had been an outspoken member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He had been involved in numerous struggles in the 1970s. Politically was someone that many of us on the left were certainly uncertain how to look at, because he seemed to make a lot of overtures towards business, the business community, seemed to try to situate himself as being an interlocutor. But in the early 80s, there was this change both in his rhetoric as well as the time. And he came in many ways by the early 80s to speak at a national level for this electoral upsurge. The electoral upsurge of Washington, of Mel King, and indeed of Federico Pena, who runs successfully for the mayor of Denver. So we have this "Run, Jesse, run." And that leads to the 84 campaign for presidency, which was very much an extension of this black-led electoral upsurge. The difference, though, and what made this very noteworthy, is that there were different forces on the left, and particularly the revolutionary left, that decided that this was a very important moment to begin to intervene and to get engaged in this effort. The other force that was very, very important in the 84 campaign was the Nation of Islam. And the decision by Minister Farrakhan, to deploy members of the Nation of Islam to play a very significant role in the 84 campaign, at least up until the notorious Hymietown incident that took place. The black left was very divided about how to respond to the Jackson campaign. And one of the preeminent forces on the black left, the National Black United Front, as an organization, played a very minimal role. But there were organized revolutionary leftists that were engaged. Now, the 84 campaign really puts Jesse on the map. And coming out of the campaign, there was some very interesting developments. So one was that there were rainbow coalitions that had emerged. And one of the most noteworthy, at least in my humble opinion, was the Vermont Rainbow Coalition. And we have the former leader of that coalition on board here, Ellen David Friedman. And what was, I actually remember when I first met Ellen, and she was giving a presentation in Cambridge. And what was fascinating was that This simply wasn't just the Jackson electoral operation, but these were leftists that were thinking long-term about how the Jackson campaign could translate into some sort of ongoing electoral, progressive electoral effort. There were other movements that came out of the '84 campaign, including the New South Coalition that was based in Alabama, and the leader, the late Gwen Patton, was a very significant force. And there were a couple of other coalitions that also came out of it. But there was a sense that we were onto something, that this would probably evolve towards an '88 campaign by Jackson. But for many of us on the left, it wasn't just the idea of a Jackson campaign, but the building of an ongoing independent progressive movement that, while not a political party, not a third party, was independent in its program and its operation and organization, and very exciting, I might add. So the work started on this. There was a Rainbow conference, I believe, in 1986, and then in the fall of '87 in North Carolina, there was a formal Rainbow Convention. And coming out of that was the idea that we were building a mass progressive movement and a mass progressive organization, that this wasn't just the Jesse Jackson show. And within this developing Rainbow Coalition, there were forces on the left. The League of Revolutionary Struggle, the Communist Workers' Party was involved. At that point, they were called the New Democratic Movement. There were independents. There was smaller groups like the Proletarian Unity League and others that engaged. The Line of March was very critical in this. And people started throwing down to build this. But there were also a lot of independent forces, small collectives, independents, that decided to get engaged in this and to play a significant role in getting this going. So these Rainbow Coalitions start popping up all over the country. And keeping in mind that for most of us on the left, the outcome was to build a mass democratic organization post '88. So then we have the '88 campaign. And the '88 campaign was qualitatively different from '84. In '84, you could say, was a direct extension of the Black-led electoral upsurge, a very direct extension. By '88, it's more than that. That in the period from '84 to '88, Jackson had been going around the country building various constituencies and linkages. He was going into the Midwest, talking to white farmers. He was going to Jay, Maine, talking to white workers. He was going to Indian reservations. He was in barrios around the country. He was reaching out to Asian Americans, and he was building something that was very unique. And politically, I would argue, it was left populist, and in fact, to the left of Bernie Sanders in terms of his actual platform, when you look at it. And it was much more comprehensive as a platform than many of us are used to. This wasn't a single issue or oppositional campaign. And also, he was running to win. Now, this may sound strange looking back, because in '88, we knew on one hand, Jackson was not going to win. But on the other hand, we weren't so sure, because there was a way within the campaign that this was very, very serious. And it was taken very seriously, that we're going to run and we're going to raise hell. And in fact, after Jackson won the Michigan primary, there was a cover, I believe, of either Newsweek or Time magazine that said, "What does Jesse want?" Right? And it was like remarkable, because clearly now the Democratic Party establishment understood this was a very serious campaign that was underway. Now, in addition to the left forces, there were mainstream Democratic Party black folks that were involved, and some other minority groups that were involved, but the principal group being African Americans. And this was a very complicated force. And by the way, Rishi, how much time do I have?
We're pretty far over, but I saved us a little time earlier. So if you can wrap in like 90 seconds, that'd be great.
Okay. So So what happens, what's interesting about this is that many of these mainstream African-American Democrats were actually ambivalent about Jesse Jackson. They weren't sure that they trusted him. They definitely weren't so comfortable with the idea of him being too close. But because there was this mass movement that emerged, they knew that they had to throw down in support of the candidacy. So there were remarkable gains. And then after the campaign, and then after the November 88 election, the question was, what happens next? And this is where I will close off. In March 1989, the Rainbow Executive Board met, and Jackson carried out what I've described as a coup against himself. That is, he basically restructured the Rainbow in its entirety and reversed all direction from a mass democratic organization to basically becoming Jackson's personal organization. Mainstream Black Democrats, for a variety of reasons, supported this. The left was largely in dismay, and I would argue that to a great extent, we've never recovered since. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Bill. That was remarkably pithy, and it probably was. It was always going to be unfair to ask for that in 6 minutes. Let's dive right into questions. That summary alone raises a number of discussion points. Jamala, I'm going to direct the first question to you. Why did you and/or your organization engage in the Rainbow Coalition and the Jackson 84 and 88 campaigns? And to what extent were you driven by views and strategies in electoral politics versus views and strategies on the national movements?
So I'm Jamala Rogers. At the time of the Rainbow Coalition, I was a member of the League for Revolutionary Struggle. And one of my most memorable assignments was to spend 6 weeks in the Black Belt South prior to Super Tuesday, and to follow the Jackson campaign and be there when he arrived. So I was actually writing for Unity newspaper, but it was hard to keep my organizing hat off. So I actually did a little bit of both. I was actually also a part of the, I'm talking about as we went into the Rainbow Coalition, being a part of the National Black Assembly, and even the Gary Convention, the National Black United Front. So all of that stuff was happening at that time. So I got a good feel for how people felt about electoral politics and this perennial, persistent debate amongst the left in terms of should we be involved, which I'm quite frankly fatigued with. So to answer your question, the League for Revolutionary Struggle expended a lot of resources and effort into the campaign for Jesse Jackson and ultimately the Rainbow Coalition. And I think the major reason was because as part of our left strategy, we did believe that the Rainbow Coalition had the capacity to build democratic structures, fight for democracy, fight for self-determination, build power in locals. And so our vision was actually, most of our vision was beyond Jesse Jackson himself, but to look at the bigger picture, the more long-term picture, which unfortunately, and maybe we can get into this later in terms of what the failures of it was, and even some of the internal debates within the organization that I think in some ways gave misplaced loyalties to both Jesse Jackson and time to him as a messiah, as opposed to really looking at building an independent movement.
Great. Thanks, Jamala. Kathy, same question. Why did you and your organization engage in the Rainbow Coalition and the Jackson campaigns? To what extent were you driven by your strategies around electoral politics versus strategies on national movements?
Okay, well, at the time, I was a national co-coordinator of the KDP, the Union of Democratic Filipinos, which worked in the US and Canada, organizing among in the Filipino community and also on international issues, especially around the Philippines. And I was also on the executive board of the Line of March. So both of these organizations participated in the Rainbow, but I want to, kind of draw a distinction in terms of motivation. So I think for KDP, we had always had a very strong program of community organizing, especially around questions of race. We did a lot of alliance building and what we call working class issues. And when the opportunity came up to work around the Rainbow, we thought it was actually an important one to locate ourselves in coalition with other like-minded progressives. And I think we certainly were also drawn into kind of almost an exploratory experience in electoral work. Frankly, many of us had little to no experience whatsoever in the electoral arena. I did in high school, as an idealistic, senior in high school, and I'd never registered to vote until Jesse ran. And I think that was the experience of a lot of people. For Line of March, we did look at this, I think, with a lot more, also with a lot of caution. And I don't think we, from the point of view of Line of March, threw ourselves into this arena and this work maybe as aggressively as some other entities. But certainly for folks who were working on issues around the country, who were doing labor work, work around race and women, we saw a value, in a very similar way to participating, in the Rainbow. And I have to say, I mentioned this in some of our earlier email exchange. I was also doing work, my direct organizing was on immigration. And in '84, Jesse went with us to a march at the San Diego border as a candidate. And it was an inspiring moment. And for, I think, immigrant communities doing work and feeling very much in isolation, the standpoint that he took was really important. So even in a setting where, the organizing that we were doing was not going to itself necessarily engage in the electoral work, the coalition opportunity that it provided was key. We were really disappointed when we found at the first convention that the charter actually mentioned the word citizens, and that this was going to be an organization very much tied into electoral work. And when we had understood it to be an organization that basically was going to build movement. So we were ready to do a massive walkout the next morning when we discovered that. Had conversations with some senior folks in the campaign who told us, frankly, you folks don't matter. But apparently, there was some further discussion on that. The next morning, the charter was changed and the word citizen was taken out. And it was in response, I think, to a lot of concerns raised by those of us who were throwing into the Rainbow, who were not citizens, but who saw this as an important opportunity for alignment.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. Bill Fletcher, can I toss it over to you?
So actually, I wanted to ask Ellen, so how did things come together in Vermont? And I still want to know what was the key to the success and the long-term success of the Vermont Rainbow?
So by way of brief introduction, my life since the early 1970s has been grounded in the labor movement. I've been a union organizer since then. And my work in independent electoral politics was secondary to that, but constantly integrated because it was so clear that this is where most people in our country see themselves as political actors, and it was impossible to avoid that question. So the background in Vermont has its own particular history. Some people on the call will know that Bernie Sanders had already been elected mayor of Burlington in 1981 as an independent. Those of us on the left who were experimenting with electoral politics at all, clustered there, not in the Democratic Party. And when Jackson showed up in '84, and it really was because of things that other people have already mentioned, in this incredibly galvanizing vision of a very, very radical fusion of politics that was grounded in race and class, dealing with issues of immigration, rural politics. He talked about tax policy and about, public. He was able to identify far earlier than many of us could what all the valences of the neoliberal political program were, and called them out and said, we've got to do this together. It was such an inescapably compelling call, so that many of us from the left, and I was not in a political organization at the time, probably closest to Solidarity. I've always been very close to Labor Notes, but not a member. In any event, Bernie's background meant, and our work in the Progressive Coalition meant that people started out rather skeptical of somebody even as good as Jackson was, who was running as a Democrat. We therefore were inoculated against deep involvement with the Democratic Party, and we began with and sustained a project of inside-outside political work from that first moment, from 1984 through to 1993. So we continued, we ran candidates initially under the Progressive Coalition name, then we organized as a minor party in Vermont, the Vermont Progressive Party, organized as a minor party in 93, a major party in 99, and have continued to function that way to the present day. I think what characterized some difference for us vis-a-vis the Rainbow experience was that in '89, at that fateful moment when Jackson said to all the state parties or state organizations that we should stand down and we should demobilize, we just said, never mind, we're not going to. And it was probably because we'd already had at that point more than 10 years of independent electoral experience, electing people to city councils and state legislature outside of the Democratic Party, that gave us the sense of confidence and necessity to keep going. We weren't relying on the national organization for anything. And we thought it was simply a mistake, that there was a lot of work left to be done in this realm. So we continued. And, at the present moment, we have candidates, lieutenant governor in Vermont as a progressive. We have members in the state Senate and the state House, and really hold down that pole of left electoral politics.
Thank you. I'm curious, this question is to actually to Bill and Warren about struggles that went on in your respective organization about in '84 and '88, and many of us came out of a very anti-electoral left background, very suspicious of left politics, even if we had been involved, as Kathy mentioned, as teenagers. But once we became radicalized, we knew the truth, and at that point we abandoned electoral politics. But then something happened in the early '80s, and folks started to change. And I'm just curious, in the LRS, what happened?
Well, if I may
Go for it.
start. One of the things to put in a historical context, the LRS actually boycotted the 1980 elections. And we saw Ronald Reagan's election as the worst possible ever. Of course, we didn't know what was going to happen today, or we didn't know about George Bush #1 and #2. But we saw the Reagan election as close to the right as we could imagine at that time. So we didn't hesitate at all, I think, to get into the '84 or '88 campaigns with Jesse. I think in hindsight, we probably gave up too much in terms of what Jamala was talking about. earlier about tailing Jesse a little bit, especially in the '89 period. But that was the context, because we had sat out the earlier elections, and Jesse did have the most progressive message in '84 and '88. We felt we needed to get back in, also because as a way of building the mass movement, because the masses were going to vote. The masses were much more engaged in electoral politics, even if we were going to sit it out.
Can you just introduce yourself, Warren?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was a member of the LRS in the from the 70s to our dissolution in the 90s. And actually in '88, I worked on the Jesse Jackson campaign as part of his labor staff, which mainly I was out hustling the unions to either give him money or an endorsement, and at the minimum to stay neutral during the primary. So that's what my main job was. And I also went down to Houston for Super Tuesday.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to add to that?
Sure. My name is Bill Gallegos. I'm in Los Angeles, and I was a member of the League of Revolutionary Struggle. But before that, I had been, my origins are in the Chicano liberation struggle out of Colorado with the Crusade for Justice. And one of the trajectories led me to La Raza Unida Party, which was a major force in the Chicano Latino struggle, especially in the Southwest, which started as an electoral program in South Texas, where they actually took over the city council in the 1970s. And chapters developed throughout the Southwest, including in California, and we became active. So we were active in electoral politics through that vehicle because we felt we had been betrayed by the Democratic Party. So we tried to build an independent political vehicle, and we ran candidates in Los Angeles. We ran a campaign to incorporate unincorporated East Los Angeles, ran candidates in the Oakland area, where we were supported by the Black Panther Party. So there was some experience there. And then when I became part of the League of Revolutionary Struggle, as Warren said, we basically had an abstentionist perspective until the Jesse Jackson campaign in '84. And I'm going to focus more on '88. And I would say a lot of our encouragement to become a part of this came from our comrades who were involved in the Black liberation struggle and said, this is not a bogus electoral campaign. This is very much emerging out of the Black freedom movement, and we need to be a part of it. And they talked about the mass rallies of thousands and thousands of African Americans chanting, "Run, Jesse, run," and that there was a real social movement underneath this. This was not like some of the left campaigns that have been run by some organizations that had very, very progressive platforms, but no social base under them. And when we saw Jesse's platform, it was like the dream platform for the left. You know, a massive tax the rich, cut the military budget, a massive jobs and education program, equal rights amendment for women, recognition of Palestinian statehood, full rights for immigrants. I mean, it was just opposition to English only, things that were of special importance to us. So this was really very, very significant. And when we saw the kind of campaign that Jesse was doing, for example, talking to white farmers in the Midwest and unemployed white workers in Yorktown and in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Illinois, saying, who took your farm? Who moved your plant? You think it was Mrs. Martinez in East Los Angeles? You think it was Mrs. Brown in Alabama? Who's doing this to you? It's the same people that are screwing over Chicanos and Latinos. It's the same people that are screwing over African Americans. I think we have a common adversary here in the big banks and in Wall Street. So he was talking about Main Street over Wall Street way before we heard that slogan in the 2016 campaign. And this really appealed to us. And I think for the League of Revolutionary Struggle, which always felt like what we call the national question was of strategic importance for the left, this campaign to us seemed a vehicle where we could begin to really build the kind of unity of oppressed peoples, of national liberation struggles, and progressive whites that could be transformative. So I think that's what really drew us in. And I was part of Latinos for Jackson, but the LRS was active in Asian Pacific Islanders for Jackson, Labor for Jackson, Peace Activists for Jackson. It was really, I think, just an enormous and enthusiastic response that our organization had. But we were pretty much, as Warren said, we were babes in the woods. And I think we had a lot of illusions about, what this arena really meant.
Thank you very much. Rishi?
Yeah, thanks all of you for that. Ted, I want to go ahead and bring you in. And I'd love to hear a bit about, what motivated your participation in the Rainbow Coalition. What was your participation? What motivated it? Was it the sort of the program as Bill Gallegos was talking about? Was it the possibility to build an independent left, something along the lines that Kathy was talking about? What was it that really sort of motivated your work inside of the Rainbow?
My primary work was in relationship back then with the National Committee for Independent Political Action that in part emerged out of efforts led by Arthur Kanoy in particular, as well as other people, to form a mass political party alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. A couple of the key kind of strategic perspectives of that effort were, number one, the centrality of the African American freedom movement and the centrality of the struggle against racism, and also the whole concept of a strategic alliance that would link sectors of the population that ordinarily do not connect up and work together in political struggle. And so when Jesse Jackson began talking about running for president in 1983, there was what became the National Committee for Independent Political Action. There was a kind of a beginnings of it during that time period, and I remember our first kind of public statement was called, supporting him running for the presidency, his program, the range of issues he was addressing, the constituencies that he was bringing together, the fact that it was it was a Black-led movement. All of those things really appealed to us, and we, though we were all about trying to build towards essentially a mass third party, we had enough smarts, enough people in our group were smart enough to realize that we use the concept of transitional stages, that things don't just happen, that there's transitional stages that have to be gone through to get to what you're trying to get towards. So we were very active in that campaign. We were active up until the March 1989. One quick point on that. There was a commission that was established after the 1988 election, after the Democratic primary, by Reverend Jackson, of 15 people, to look at what's the best organizational framework for the Rainbow Coalition going forward. And I remember that there was a division within that commission, 9-6, as I remember. The 9 people supported a structure that was very top down, really, as I remember it. And then the other 6 supported a structure that had more democracy. It still very much recognized, of course, Reverend Jackson as the leader of the Rainbow, but it was an effort to be more democratic. And I remember at that meeting in March, I wasn't there, but others were who I worked with. It was pretty bad. Just my last point. I kind of came away personally from that experience feeling like we really had to watch out for individuals within the left who had a great deal of power, that we needed much more democratic and more collectively led structures if we were going to have a chance of hanging together, working together, and achieving victory. And I've only actually come to believe in that even more over the years as I've continued to do this work.
Actually, I'd like to ask a question each of you to respond to briefly, which is, what were you looking to see happen after '88? I mean, and I don't mean just like after the Democratic Convention, because there were divisions about whether people should support Dukakis or just sit home or whatever. But particularly in terms of what should happen with the Rainbow, what was it that you were advocating and what were you expecting? So you started to respond to that, Ted. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, but I'd like others to comment on that.
I could just add real quickly, what we saw as the great potential, and what was happening was there were state conventions happening all over the country. Actually, those were happening in 1988 after the Democratic Convention. People were just taking the initiative, organizing. Sometimes I remember 700 or 800 people in California. Is what I remember hearing, and they were happening all over. And that's what we thought was the. I mean, I remember being part of one in New York, upstate New York, with Arthur Eve, and that was the potential that the Rainbow had. This really dynamic force developing much more with a grassroots connection and organization that could keep this moving forward and becoming a real powerful force.
Who wants to go next? Warren?
Well, I think, one of the things that happened is that the left by 89, a lot of the independent left groups had already dissolved, because I know the LRS dissolved in 1990. So by 1989, we were already on our way. And I think some of the people in the national leadership knew it, even if the rank and file did not. And I think what happened was that I think we did end up tailing Jesse more than we should have. Especially, there was also a division. I think the African-American cadre who worked with Jesse knew him the best and also had the most doubts about his acceptance of the left. But the ironic thing was that a lot of the Asian American cadre ended up on his staff. So just like the difference between union staff and rank and file union members, Bill, which I think you well know, we ended up supporting Jesse when he said, it's time for us to move on and to dissolve. This is what we're going to do. And I think that especially a lot of the folks who made it on to high levels of the campaign staff supported him. And the other thing that was happening is because the dissolution was well in sight with the LRS, a lot of the, how should I say this? A lot of the comrades that were ready to move back into the mainstream already had that idea in mind. So there were already local races that people were thinking about running for, although it was not spoken about at the time. And I think that made it much easier to kind of meld into the Democratic Party. Having done their job at the Rainbow, but now they could say the Rainbow's over, we're back and we're going to run for our local office in whatever capacity as a part of the left, if you will, of the Democratic Party. So they were no longer a threat as an independent force. I think that's really what happened with us.
Thank you. Ellen?
Yeah, I have to say that this has become clearer and clearer over time that we had the experience both in our work with Reverend Jackson and with Bernie Sanders that you encounter sometimes these historically very significant individuals with tremendous capacity to analyze, to integrate a program, to compellingly speak to people across lines of class, race, and so on. So they call into existence the factors that we need to build a powerful, democratic, rank and file grassroots movement. But then both something about their personality, as well, of course, as the political culture that we exist in, means that it translates at best into a vehicle for them as individuals, and does not translate into the kind of organization which I think many of us on this panel would agree we are seeking. Certainly in the labor movement, in which I am most deeply engaged, the struggle for rank and file democratic unions, not dissimilar. So I guess I would say that our hopes then remain true. Can we draw into existence this kind of compelling dynamic that brings people in but then we are mature enough, we're capable enough to build structures that allow us to survive the individual exigencies of a single personality. We were not successful with that with Jesse.
William?
Yeah, I think as Warren said, we were going through a transition period, I think, in the League of Revolutionary Struggle. But there was a lot of sentiment, I think, and I worked mostly with Chicanos Latinos for Jackson. And we were in touch with folks in Texas, in New Mexico, and Colorado. We were in touch with Puerto Ricanos on the East Coast that had come out of the Young Lords Party. So there was a real sense of optimism and hope that the Rainbow would emerge as kind of a multi-issue organization that could do electoral politics, but could also organize and take up campaigns. I think that was the sentiment among a lot of people. And I want to just say something about the League of Revolutionary Struggle's kind of perspective in that period on the left. So it's funny, within the Rainbow, we worked with all kinds of Democratic Party folks, a lot of whom were hacks, and a lot of good folks as well. So we worked with a wide range of forces, but we really had a standoffish and probably somewhat sectarian attitude towards a lot of the other groups on the left, the Communist Party, the PUL, the Line of March. So we tolerated the participation of these other groups in the Jesse Jackson campaign. I mean, there wasn't a lot we could have done about it. But I think sometimes we used the positions that we had as staff members in the campaigns to actually block some of the initiatives of comrades from the left. And I think that was a real, it was a very, very serious error, because after March of '89, when the decision was made to pretty much dysfunctionalize the Rainbow, there was no kind of united left grouping that could come together, do an assessment, and say, what can we do to try to influence this tendency within the Rainbow Coalition? We were pretty much all out there on our own. So I think that was a real mistake that we made. So on one hand, our United Front work, I think, was pretty exemplary. We worked with trade union officials and elected officials and so on. But as to the left, I think we really shot ourselves in the foot.
Jamala? Thank you, Bill. Jamala?
I agree with my comrades from the League. And I would add that I'm not surprised that the Vermont chapter was able to survive. And I think the points that Ellen raised, the main one is that they were alive and well before the Rainbow. And so there were a number of challenges that I think led to the collapse of the Rainbow. I mean, obviously, Jesse's sellout was one, but I think that geographically there were some challenges. Organizationally, there were challenges. We just weren't mature enough to withhold or keep together a national formation like this. I mean, we were, in some states, we weren't even able to keep those formations statewide. In Missouri, Jesse had a huge impact on the farmers here. He came in '86, put with his overalls on, rode the tractor down with the farmers, and that was a lasting impression. I remember one of the farmers saying, now he clearly understood, based on Jesse Jackson's platform, that being unemployed didn't mean you were lazy, which was a notion that he had picked up from the mainstream media, that Black folks, they unemployed, must be lazy. Well, here he is with no farm and had worked his behind off. He knew that couldn't apply to him. So these folks were transformed. So, and the reason I'm mentioning that is because 30 years later, we have now created what's called a Black Rural Integrated Voter Project in the state of Missouri. And myself and Rhonda Perry, who heads up the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, which was the farmers who brought Jesse Jackson, are now helping to lead this. And so 30 years later, we're talking to a new generation of folks about the Rainbow Coalition, because people were so transformed by the agenda, by the energy of that campaign. And so the recreation of it, I think, has existed and is existing in certain places, just not as the Rainbow Coalition.
Thank you. Over to you, Rishi.
Thanks. Kathy, did you want to jump in on that question too?
Sure, and thanks to comrades for those observations. In my experience, the KDP as a revolutionary mass organization also dissolved by 1988. The Line of March also ended in 1989. But certainly I think for LOM, well before that time, the disillusionment with the rainbow had well set in. So I think, similar to what folks have observed, we certainly saw how other folks, some folks in the left, had positioned themselves within the institution. We also saw how a lot of the coalition was still wrapped around Jesse as a figure, and that there was a real failure to build the kind of infrastructure and process as an institution that could weather a storm, that could, was not just bent on mobilizing in the moment, and kind of following the momentum and dynamics of an electoral campaign, but could really engage in kind of the diversity of the demographic, the complexity of issues, and provide the kind of support the discussion that we needed at a certain scope and scale. And in the end, there just seemed to be a real lack of accountability of the organization. So when decisions were made, in the change of the organization, frankly, for many of us, it's like, well, that decision had already been made. And I think, we certainly still maintained interest. And I think among folks who came out of that process, certainly my experience of activists from KDP or Line of March, a lot of people remained engaged and continued organizing in different sectors. And frankly, like many of us, probably, wish at this point we had an institution that could envelop the broader movement and provide a venue for the kinds of serious discussions that we need. How many of us have said that, over the past few years? Where's the party when you need one? Mm-hmm. So we were, I think, really disappointed and disillusioned, and not willing to throw in to the end to try to say something which at that point we certainly were not positioned to do so, and was going in a direction that we were really disappointed in. And I think, as others have said, it's kind of the history of a lot of lessons of organizations that, while you think they're not built around charismatic figures, really are. Mm-hmm. And the serious work of building institutions that can have an impact on the whole country, that there just wasn't that attention. And, to the extent that those of us on the left had a part in not to come together to provide that kind of strategic, even identify that and come together with that kind of strategic task, we bear some responsibility as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. That was great. Yeah, I want to pick up on a theme and look at the legacy of the rainbow work from the perspective of sort of what's possible or not possible today. I'd love to hear how all of you think about what lessons the Rainbow Coalition has for how we should think about the Democratic Party and the potential success or not of inside-outside strategies. Is your reflection that that inside-outside strategies are bound to fail because of the nature of the party? I think Jamala and Lydia in the chat box are raising the sort of question of, if the left is not strong enough to build an independent vehicle, how should we really think about inside-outside strategies? Are we bound to be squashed or co-opted or what? So how do you all evaluate the sort of question of independent political organization and inside-outside strategy given the rainbow years? I'm going to come to Ellen first, and then I'm going to come back to Kathy.
We've had 35 years or so of actual concrete experience in building an independent party in Vermont, and Vermont is way easier for many, many reasons than other states and other parts of the country. That said, it is grueling beyond imagination. The legal obstacles, the regulatory obstacles, especially now after Citizens United, the inability to really effectively control issues like campaign expenditures, campaign financing, donation, reporting, all of that. All of the dark money that is flooding into electoral politics is way worse now than it was, 30 or 40 years ago. So we've had to exert a tremendous amount of discipline to get through tedious, endless battles, and most of the battles are with the Democrats. The only way in which we have maintained a slightly inside-outside position in Vermont, because some of our candidates now are leading candidates and office holders, including the lieutenant governor, run in a Democratic primary in order to knock out other Democratic candidates, and then run as a progressive / Democrat. So every state, we know the voting laws are different in every state. In Vermont, you can run on two lines. The first line determines who you caucus with. So most of our office holders now run that way. I think the only reason we can do that is because we punish Democrats and we cause Democrats to be defeated in various races because we were willing to run against them and run the risk of having Republicans elected. So I would say what is most encouraging to me now is that we are seeing instances of leftists running in Democratic primaries. Obviously, we just saw that this week. That's encouraging to me. Otherwise, I think if you can't prove to them that you can actually hurt them and defeat them in office, you will be incorporated, you'll be co-opted, you'll be marginalized, you'll be taken over. So under most circumstances, an inside-outside strategy will not work. You have to build power sufficient as a totally independent organization in order to discipline their worst impulses.
Thanks, Ellen. Let me come to Kathy.
Yeah, well, I think we have the experience now where I don't know how many, close friends are running for office at different levels. And, it's because that discussion has not seriously taken place on inside-outside strategy. A lot of that is driven by their own positioning, particular regions where their voice is very important at different levels, whether it's at a national level in Congress or at a city level. So it's not necessarily based on an inside-outside strategy. It's more the pragmatics of political positioning and responding to needs in a defined geographic area. And to the extent, for example, in California, where numbers of folks, and largely from Asian Latino communities, running for office that reflect some of the demographic change as well in the state, running at city levels, it's been important, and their candidacies often based on very progressive platforms have galvanized, served to galvanize a lot of political organizing. That said, what we did, a number of us back in 2007 did in California was to create something. It was the Mobilize Immigrant Vote, which was a movement building approach to the electoral arena, recognizing demographic change and recognizing the need for long-term engagement and the complexities of dealing with very diverse populations. Brought together an organization that is focused around community education, voter education, but as well naturalization, get out the vote, education on issues, and deals with 15 languages. And it has a long-term vision of what it means to engage in the electoral arena, and it's not wedded to citizenship. It's taking into account the whole community, our diverse, multi-status families and populations. So there's that kind of work that has to be done alongside that. And to the extent that that work also coincides with people who've been running for office on Democratic Party tickets, that's been important. And at least to the extent of folks who have run in these local elections, there's a recognition, and they're very supportive of that kind of organizing as well. But it's very isolated. It certainly doesn't come out of say a much more strategic conversation and deliberation, and certainly based in, you know, looking at an inside-outside strategy, which I agree with Ellen from my experience so far. I really believe strongly that you need to have an independent voice, and that has to be the leverage point and the for some years to come the principal venue to even approach on a scope and scale any engagement within the Democratic Party. To the extent we have folks who might have some positioning there, that's useful, but even their work is going to suffer without, I think, the evolution of something that that is independent outside the party.
Thanks, Kathy. I know we said we weren't going to ask everybody to answer the same questions, but I just really want to hear what everybody has to say. So, we're just going to keep going. Ted, do you want to tackle this one next?
Yeah, I would make a distinction between, I think totally there's a need for independent political organization that's rooted in the grassroots, working class people, communities of color, and so on. That's not the same thing as third-party organization. I think my experience definitely has said to me that this is not the moment for the creation of a left third party. That's just not real. I mean, the Green Party's failures to me are one of the examples of that. That it's not gotten traction. It's to me going backwards pretty much. So you need that. I do, at the same time, I've also pretty much come to believe, primarily on the basis of the Bernie Sanders campaign and the development out of it of our revolution, and some of the victories that we have been seeing, including, you know, a couple of the key ones just this past Tuesday, that running candidacies in the Democratic Party with an objective of trying to push the Democratic Party to the left, I think is strategic right now. I think it's strategic both for defensive reasons, in terms of the threat of fascism that's very real, but also from the standpoint of a path towards ultimate victory, ultimate winning of political power. That's where I am.
Awesome. Thanks, Ted. Let's come to Bill, and then we'll go to Jamala.
Thank you, Rishi. I guess the first thing that I would say in terms of addressing this question is, let's avoid the mistakes that we've made in the past. I think one of the things is that a lot of left organizations and individuals are very active in the electoral arena now, as you mentioned early on in introducing this program. We're still not working together in the way that we should. And I think there needs to be a very deliberate effort to bring together different left organizations to talk about this within a larger context. But this is a very, very important context, and I think we really need to try to find a way for those of us on the left, those of us who are working towards socialism, to really try to find a way to come together and increase our capacity in a principled way. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think I'm old school. I see the Democratic Party as a party of the ruling class. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But I do think it's a vehicle where we need to work. I agree with what Ted and others have said. This is a space where there's millions and millions of the members of the working class and oppressed communities that are involved. They see this as a space where they do their political activity. We need to be there. We can't concede that space to other forces that see this as just trying to cut a deal with the system as it is. So I think we need to be there. And I think we have to pursue, a very strong inside-outside strategy, while never forgetting that our organizing is critical to all this. It's not just about utilizing the electoral space as consultants do, but of really building up a mass movement, a mass base in our local areas, in our statewide areas, and using that as the the backbone of the electoral work that we do. And I think, I want to just emphasize again, I think why I think the Democratic Party is, we can see what's going on now. There's great tension within the Democratic Party. I could say here in California where I'm active, but also nationally, where they seem to be, the Democratic Party establishment seems to be doing everything they can to foreclose the growth of a Sanders wing, a progressive wing, and a wing that has any kind of left leaning. In spite of their efforts to do that, they got their butts handed to them in the Bronx and Queens and the electoral victory of Alexandria. So I think that shows us that there's still great potentiality for us to utilize this arena, but we should have no illusions about it.
Senator Jamala, let's unmute you quick.
So one of the things I think we should not underestimate, and that's the role strategically of an agenda to actually help educate and agitate and organize people around. So one of the things I see with a lot of candidates now, even ones who claim to be so-called progressive candidates, is like they really don't even have an agenda. They run it because they feel good about it and they think they can do something different. But it's not really moving the needle in terms of how we are deepening our ability to sway the masses and actually develop them in a different kind of way. So and Bill talked about this, the social forces that were mobilized and galvanized around both Jesse's campaign and around Obama's campaigns. Yet there were many folks on the left who were poo-pooing that. But I don't know, still, even in 2018, where you got the numbers of people that are mobilized, ready for, something new, something exciting, something empowering than electoral politics. And so when I'm having the debate with people about why are we following this and why are we doing this, it's like, show me the millions that you have mobilized. Obama did. So we haven't really looked at how do you organize working class people? How do you get the social forces that we're following that get swept up in these campaigns? How do you find ways to peel them off to something new and different and that has some longevity? So the other part for me as a young organizer that I saw happening is the role of the Black Democrats, particularly on the national level and on the state level too. Even from the 1972 Gary Convention to the National Black Assembly, these Negroes blocked anything that was progressive because they were fearful of giving up their power, somebody taking over and they were going to be the head person in charge. And so watching that was, I think, very disillusioning for me, but it also was a reality check that those people cannot be in control of our power. And so it's on us to continue to build the working class unity that we talked about in the 1980s and the 1970s and really actualize that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamal. I'm going to hand it over to Bill so we can ask one more round of questions. And there are some interesting questions starting to emerge in the chat box, so we'll hopefully get at least a few more minutes at the end to squeeze some of those in.
I just want to make sure that any of the panelists that everyone answered had a chance.
I didn't
Warren had something.
Oh, sorry, Warren.
Obviously, I still feel that we have to participate in electoral politics because those in office have power. And we could see, all the damage that's being done right now on a national and statewide level of the people in power. But that being said, I'm not very optimistic about the second point, which is how do we hold people accountable? Because in '88, when we supported Jesse, we did have a left organization. We thought we could hold even our own comrades accountable when they got elected, and we couldn't. So let's be honest about it. You can't hold a guy on the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco accountable. You're not gonna hold Obama accountable or anybody else. So I'm not against the electoral thing. What I'm gonna say is that I think we have to focus on rebuilding the mass movement and rebuilding those organizations we all just talked about. Because without that, especially the mass movement, we're not going to be able to hold anybody accountable. the Democratic Party in San Francisco, where I did most of my electoral work, is the home of Nancy Pelosi. It's a machine town, regardless of all the progressive facade. It's a machine town like New York and Chicago and Boston and everywhere else. If you want to play in those politics, it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of troops. And right now, we don't have the movement to just do it on our own. That's how I feel about it.
What I'm wondering after hearing you, Warren, is whether you're basically saying that it's hopeless. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm pushing the point a little bit, but where does electoral work ultimately fit in with an overall approach towards social transformation? Well, and I think you're raising a critical point, but I don't want you to answer that. I want to switch to Ellen first.
Warren, I completely agree with your point that we cannot hold politicians accountable without rebuilding a mass base in the organizations that consolidate that mass base, simply because of the inequality of money and power that neoliberalism has brought us. They will always be disciplined by the ruling class more than they will be disciplined by us in our disorganized state. So I just want to introduce into the conversation something which I have found incredibly encouraging at the start moment. So my experience in the last 30 years has been in the teacher sector of the labor movement. And I know everybody will be aware of the insurgent wildcat teacher strikes that brought hundreds of thousands of workers out on illegal strikes in West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Colorado, and North Carolina in the last few months. I've been quite involved with those and in conversations with the leaders in those groups. And the point that I want to make is this: the mass base that exists in our labor movement, and remember that the public sector is still 35-36% organized, which is very, very high by all international standards. It's incredibly densely organized. Of course, that will change after the Janus decision. But I want to point out that these insurgent strikes, these wildcat strikes, came about because the teacher base in those unions could not hold their own elected leaders accountable. Their leaders were failing to serve them in the ways that they needed to be served, both to defend their own livelihood and to defend public education. And so as a result, they acted in these very spontaneous ways, very boldly, very strategically. They now have to decide whether they're going to be able to consolidate that into forms of democratic bottom-up organization that can elect and hold leaders accountable. But that's where many of them are now focusing. I think it is on the basis of that I start to feel some optimism that we may be able to see the rebuilding of a base through working class organization, not only in labor unions, but elsewhere. And I totally agree with you that if that doesn't happen, we will never be able to hold elected officials accountable.
So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond just as Ellen did, but briefer, to the challenge that was thrown at us by Warren. Kathy?
Oh, I was just finishing typing something in the chat box. I guess, and I'll just say what I was saying in the chat box. I mean, I think had numerous conversations about, the need to look at the movement today. So, and for those of us so-called veterans of the movement from years and years ago, I'm constantly faced with with what it means to be a multi-generational movement, to the phenomena of change that has taken place in just how we operate over the last 20 years, the phenomena of the internet. I am so frustrated with virtual organizing and replacing real organizing, and the generation of mass actions with star power as if those are adequate responses to really serious issues that are on the table. And then the Democratic Party, does not help at all. And because in the midst of this, I think that type of organizing and response and feeling like you are doing something is part of the cynicism towards the failure of the Democratic Party to create a space. I mean, Dianne Feinstein, we're veterans. I mean, there are dinosaurs that have locked down the Democratic Party and are also obstacles. But I think we need to seriously look at the kinds of the change in demography, the culture of organizing that has shifted in the last 30 years, and the way, I mean, frankly, the effect of the internet. And what that has brought with it in terms of real organizing messages, our capacity to address the dominant narratives effectively. So there's, and I wish, I mean, I would really welcome a space to look more seriously at all of those phenomena. So I agree with Warren, we need a mass movement. But in order to do that, and for that movement to really reflect in serious ways who needs to be included within that, I think we have to address some of these shifts that are significant, that have happened in the last 20 to 30 years.
Ted, and I'm going to ask you to be even briefer.
Yeah, the thought that keeps coming to my mind is that nothing has been mentioned, including from me, about the issue of the climate crisis. And in this context, I just want to put out that there is a lot of organizing at a local, very grassroots level against pipelines, infrastructure, fracking, et cetera. There's a lot going on. There is coordination that's developing, and that's, I think, an important component. I also think politically, the issue of, what we are facing with the unraveling of human society and ecosystems because of global warming and the need to shift from fossil fuels. That is something that ultimately helps our movements, because it keeps a focus and a lot of people are beginning to see that. So I just want to be sure that's out there during this call. So there you go.
Thank you very much. Jamala?
Rebuilding and re-educating. We should be reframing the electoral narrative that we have now so that people understand what it means in 2018. It doesn't mean the same as it did in 1980. We need to be rebuilding the left, because that's the left organization that's needed to infuse our movement to help people understand better where we're going and why, and re-educating the masses about the role of electoral politics in their lives, because I think somebody pointed out decisions are being made for us and they're not being good decisions. And so I'm looking at the momentum that Bernie Sanders created around socialism. In Missouri, there's been polling that says Black voters are pulling away from the Democratic Party. All of those are indicators to me that people are looking for an alternative. And so these are opportunities for us to go in there and create something bold and different.
Thank you. William?
Yeah, I agree with Warren on the one hand that the electoral arena is incredibly challenging, and what especially Alan's advanced experience on this proves that. But everywhere we work is challenging. So I've been active in the environmental justice movement, and we work in the California State Legislature. We work with these incredibly horrible regulatory agencies, the Air Quality Management District, the Air Resources Board. It's hard. It's an enormous challenge to hold any of these folks accountable. Anywhere we organize, whether it's at the city council level, fighting for a living wage, whether it's at the state legislature, fighting for an equitable clean energy program. So I would say, yes, it's true. The electoral arena is especially challenging, but I don't think that's a reason not to work there. We can't concede that arena to folks who just have, I think, a very narrow self or class interest. I think we need to be there. We need to, I think, agreeing with Jamala, we need to bring ourselves together as the left. We need to have no illusions about it. We have to have a very creative approach. But I think we have to take on the challenge of holding these folks accountable. It's hard in every arena in which we work. We shouldn't let that be a reason for us to abandon this one.
Thank you. Rishi, back to you.
That was awesome. I hope people are buzzing as much as I am. That was a really incredibly rich conversation. I think we've got a lot to think about in how we're rebuilding our movement, how we're turning electoral strategies towards our advantage. So I want to give a big shout out to all of our panelists. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience for showing up, and to everybody who asked a question. I hope you'll be able to bring those questions to the online forum after. And looking forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone.